When you move into a college dorm for the first time, you're asked to do something that almost nothing else in adult life prepares you for. You share your most private space, the room where you sleep, where you keep your medications, your documents, your phone, with someone you've never met. And you trust that the system placed the right person on the other side of that door. Most of the time, the system works. But the stories we're covering tonight come from students who discovered how permeable those walls really were. Keycards, sign-in sheets, RA check-ins. None of those layers account for the simplest variable, human behavior. What happens when the person nearest to you had no right to be there at all? 5 accounts, 5 situations that started with a detail that didn't quite fit. Welcome to Mind After Dark. If you're new here, subscribe before we start, because once this first story gets going, you're not going to want to stop. Story 1. Her roommate wasn't a student. Mara Jennings arrived at Callaway University late on the second day of move-in week, which put her squarely in the dead zone afternoon, parking lot half empty, the initial chaos already settled into something quieter and more ordinary. Her mom helped carry boxes to the elevator. Her dad circled the lot looking for a closer space and never really found one. They were quiet in the way families get quiet when a goodbye is coming, and nobody wants to be the one who makes it real. Her assigned room was 214, second floor, east wing, halfway down a corridor that smelled like fresh carpet and industrial cleaning solution. Holbrook Hall was an older building, and room 214 had originally been built as a standard double 2 beds, 2 desks, 2 closets. At some point, the housing office had reclassified it as single occupancy, updating their administrative records without changing the physical layout. Both beds were still there, both desks. The room simply wasn't supposed to have 2 people living in it anymore. Mara didn't know any of that when she pushed the door open with her hip and found someone already inside. A girl around her age was sitting on the left side bed with a laptop open on her knees and a small string of warm LED lights already clipped to the headboard. She looked up when Mara came in, and she smiled. Not a caught-off-guard smile, a prepared one. "You must be Mara," she said. "I'm Danny." Mara's first impression was that Danny was the kind of person who made a room feel immediately smaller, not because she was aggressive or loud, the opposite. She was calm in a way that felt deliberately cultivated, warm in the specific way of someone who had already decided how she wanted you to feel about her. She had dark hair pulled back loosely, a Callaway sweatshirt with fold lines still in it, and a keycard lanyard hanging on the hook by the door like she'd been living there a week. Mara's mom raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. They unloaded the boxes. Danny offered to help. Mara's dad shook Danny's hand and said it was nice to meet her, and then, because parents eventually run out of reasons to stay, her family left. That first night was fine. Better than fine, actually. Danny knew the dining hall schedule, which RA was strict about quiet hours and which one never came out of his room after 9. She knew the East Wing elevator stuck between floors in the late afternoon and that the stairs were faster. She had a small portable speaker that played soft music while they both lay in their separate beds, scrolling their phones, and Mara fell asleep thinking she'd gotten lucky. The first odd thing was the photographs, or the absence of them. Mara had put a photo strip from senior prom on her desk, a picture of her and her best friend from home in a magnetic frame. Danny's desk held a lamp, a notebook, and a water bottle. No photos, no hometown coffee mug, nothing that suggested a life before Callaway. When Mara mentioned it, Danny said she was a minimalist, then redirected the conversation so smoothly that Mara was 2 topics away before she noticed it had happened. The second thing was harder to name. Danny attended orientation events, sat in the right sessions, chatted with other students in the hallway. But she never seemed to carry anything to class. No bag, no laptop case, no notebook tucked under her arm. When Mara asked what her major was, Danny said undecided. Asked again a week later, same answer, same practiced ease, same pivot. Mara started watching mornings. She had an 8 o'clock Tuesday-Thursday, up by 7. Danny was always there when she left, and there when she returned. On days Mara had afternoon classes, Danny was around the dorm. She had explanations for everything. Professors who canceled. A schedule that ran heavy in the evenings. Online coursework handled in the room. None of it was impossible. None of it required her to go anywhere. She might have let it go, written Danny off as a homebody, and moved on, except for what happened at the housing office. Mara stopped in on a Tuesday morning about a fee on her student account she didn't recognize. The woman at the desk fixed the billing issue, then paused with a slight look of confusion and said that room 214 was listed as single occupancy. No second resident was assigned to it. Mara said she had a roommate. The woman looked at the screen again and said she wasn't seeing a second student on that room. Mara pulled out her phone and showed her a photo taken in the room during the first week. Danny was turned slightly away from the camera. Mara realized she turned away from cameras in every photo, but she was clearly there. The woman said she'd look into it and asked Mara to follow up in a few days. That evening, Mara mentioned it. Casually, getting ready for bed, said she'd stopped by housing, and they'd told her the room was listed as single, laughing a little like it was obviously just an administrative thing. Danny didn't laugh. She held Mara's eyes for a moment with a very still expression and asked which person she'd spoken to at housing. Said it calmly, like she was gathering information. Mara gave a vague answer. Danny said housing made those kinds of errors all the time and that she'd handle it herself, and she said it with enough quiet certainty that Mara dropped it. The next morning, Danny suggested they walk to the dining hall by a different route, one that looped around the administrative building. She framed it as a preference. It felt like a boundary. For meals, Mara had assumed Danny was just swiping her student card at the dining hall like everyone else. What she noticed later, once she was paying closer attention, was that Danny never swiped anything. She'd sometimes hold back near the entrance, wait until Mara had swiped through, and then follow during the brief moment the turnstile was moving. On other days, she wasn't at the dining hall at all. Mara noticed snacks appearing on Danny's desk, packaged things, the kind sold at the campus convenience store for cash. Small things, unobtrusive, nothing that asked a question Mara knew to ask yet. It was the freshman directory that cracked it open. Mara was eating lunch with 2 girls from her English composition class and mentioned her roommate. One of them, Priya, asked which Danny she meant. Mara showed her a photo on her phone, one of the few where Danny hadn't fully turned away from the camera. Priya frowned and pulled up the incoming student directory on her university app. They went through it together, no Donnie matching the description, no photograph that came close. Mara told herself the directory was incomplete, told herself students opted out, walked back to Holbrook Hall with a cold feeling she was trying to argue herself out of. She stopped at the RA's door instead of going to her room. Tyler, a junior, leaned in his doorframe and said he thought he'd met Danny. Dark hair, always polite, right? Then he said something that caught Mara sideways. He'd assumed Mara had arranged a registered guest stay. Extended guest visits had to be logged with housing after 72 hours. He said he'd meant to mention it, but figured they'd sorted it at the front desk. A guest stay, not a roommate. Mara went back to her room and sat on her bed and looked at the key card on Danny's lanyard and thought about how a working key card gets issued to someone who isn't a student. Callaway's electronic key cards weren't sold or duplicated. They were programmed through the housing system and tied to individual accounts. But there was a category of temporary credential, a move-in access card, issued on short-term request for incoming students who needed to begin carrying boxes or access the building before their official check-in was complete. A current student named Jessie had made that request for a guest who was helping her move in. A desk worker had processed it. The card had been issued with a 5-day expiration date, but the clerk had entered the year incorrectly in the system. The card didn't expire. It stayed active. Mara didn't know any of this yet that night. She only knew about the key card on the lanyard. She texted her mom. "Just a feeling," she said. "Something's wrong with my roommate. Can you call me tomorrow?" She lay in the dark and listened to Danny's breathing and counted the things Danny knew about her. Her class schedule, her family's phone numbers mentioned in passing, the drawer where she kept her student ID and her health insurance card. The PIN Mara had typed into her laptop one afternoon without thinking, with Danny sitting 4 feet away. She was at the housing office when it opened the next morning. She asked for the same woman. The woman remembered her and said she'd flagged the room for review but hadn't heard from any student named Danny. No student by that name was enrolled at Callaway. She made a phone call while Mara stood at the counter. When she hung up, she asked Mara to sit down. What investigators eventually pieced together through housing records and the account of a student named Jessie, who came forward only after meeting with housing staff, was this. The woman living in room 214 was 24 years old. Her name wasn't Danny. Investigators confirmed she had used a similar name at a college in another state roughly 2 years prior, where she'd stayed in campus housing without enrollment. Beyond that, how many times she'd done this, and where wasn't something investigators could fully verify. What they knew was the situation in front of them. She had met Jessie during a Callaway campus visit the previous summer and kept in contact over social media. When Jessie arrived for move-in week, they met up. Jessie let her stay in her room the first night as a favor. She hadn't understood that she intended to stay. The temporary move-in credential had been issued legitimately through Jessie's request and had simply never expired. Room 214 had been selected deliberately. In a private incoming student Facebook group, Mara had posted asking if anyone else had been assigned a single room that still had 2 beds, mentioning her room number and that she was arriving late on the second day of move-in week. She'd been venting, looking for others in the same situation. She'd gotten a few sympathetic replies from strangers. One of those strangers had been paying close attention. She had known Mara's name because she'd chosen her. She'd gotten ready. She'd waited. Campus security asked her to leave that afternoon with Jessie and an RA present. She went quietly. Her belongings filled one small duffel bag. The LED lights were hers. Mara moved into a new room 2 days later and requested a floor with a different RA, one who did regular check-ins. Her mom shipped her a small door alarm, a wedge type that housing approved, and she used it every night for the rest of that year. She told me that the thing she kept returning to wasn't the fear exactly. It was how much had been learned without her noticing. The curated warmth, the practiced deflections, the way "you must be Mara" had been said with such easy familiarity, like a greeting between people who already knew each other. They didn't know each other. Only one of them had done any knowing at all. The security most dorm residents think about is at the entrance, the front door, the lobby turnstile, the stairwell swipe. That logic assumes the threat comes from outside. The next story is about what happens in the spaces where that logic doesn't reach. One floor below the rooms. In a part of the building most people move through as quickly as possible. Story 2. The man in the laundry room, Kelsey Park, was a sophomore when she first saw him, and she almost didn't notice him at all. It was a Thursday night in October, just after 2 in the morning. She was doing laundry because she'd run out of clean gym clothes and had a 6 o'clock workout the next day. The laundry room in the basement of Deacon Hall was narrow and fluorescent lit and smelled like other people's dryer sheets, and the machines on the left side clanked through the spin cycle like something was caught in the drum. Kelsey had her earbuds in and a reading assignment on her phone when she came in, so it took a moment to register that she wasn't alone. He was sitting on the wooden bench along the far wall. A man older, maybe late 50s, in a dark jacket and jeans, hands folded in his lap. A small duffel bag sat at his feet. He smiled when she looked up. She pulled one earbud out. He said he was waiting for a cycle to finish. Said the machine on the end was his. The machine on the end was running. She told herself that was fine, loaded her own machine, sat at the opposite end of the bench, and put her earbud back in. She read 2 pages of her assignment without retaining any of it. The man didn't move, didn't check his phone, didn't do anything except sit with his hands folded while his machine ran. When it finished, he transferred clothes to a dryer, mostly dark items, and sat back down. After a while, she stopped tensing every time he shifted. By the time her cycle finished, she felt a little foolish. She said goodnight to him and went upstairs. She saw him again 12 days later. Same time, same bench, same dark jacket. This time, there was no machine running when she came in. He was just sitting. He looked up and said something about insomnia, laughed a little. She didn't laugh with him. She loaded her machine and sat closer to the door. He started talking, said his daughter lived in the building, a junior named Michelle. Said he'd driven up for a visit, she'd been busy, so he'd come down here to pass the time. He visited every few weeks, he said. Kelsey said she thought she knew most of the juniors on her floor and had never heard the name Michelle. He said Michelle was on the 3rd floor, kept to herself, mostly. Kelsey nodded and looked at her phone. She left when her cycle finished without looking back. But on the stairs, she thought about the machine running the first time, not at all the second. He had his duffel bag both times. He wasn't doing laundry. She mentioned it to her friend Diana the next morning. Diana told her to go in the daytime from now on. She did, mostly. She avoided the late-night trips for 3 weeks, doing laundry on Saturday afternoons when other people were around. Then a sports bra went missing. One she was almost certain she'd put in the wash because she remembered the broken clasp on the band. She looked through her drawers twice and let it go. 2 weeks later, a pair of athletic shorts, then a long-sleeved shirt from the bookstore's custom order line, her name printed across the back. Gone. She told herself she was absent-minded. 15 credits, 12 hours a week in the campus library, 6 hours of sleep on a good night. Things got misplaced. Then Diana came to her and said something strange had happened. She'd had a full box of granola bars in the communal kitchen cabinet and was now down to 2. And her laundry had come out of the dryer with an unfamiliar sock in it, same brand, same size, but older, softer, more worn. She had 7 of her brand, and now she had 8. They stood in Diana's room looking at the sock. Kelsey went back down to the laundry room that Sunday afternoon, and looked at the space with different eyes. The bench, the machines, the wooden shelf where people left fabric softener and forgotten items. A small wire rack on the shelf had the usual dorm debris, a single glove, a pillowcase, a few stray socks. She almost turned to go. Then he came in, not from the hallway, from the machine area, from behind the last dryer in the row, where there was a shallow alcove the machines partially obscured. He was bent slightly, doing something near the back wall. He didn't notice her immediately. Kelsey stood very still. He straightened and saw her. He smiled the same way he had before practiced, immediate, and started to say something about the dryers being old, about checking a setting on the machine. She watched his hands. He was holding something, a long-sleeved shirt folded once. The university bookstore logo was visible on the front. She said, very evenly, "That's not yours." He looked at the shirt. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not guilt exactly, more like recalculation. He said he'd found it on the floor, said he'd been about to put it in the lost and found. She took a step toward the door. He moved at the same angle, unhurried, just positioning. Not blocking her directly, but narrowing the route. She said she was late meeting someone upstairs, and she needed to go, and as she said it, she pulled her phone out and called Diana. Not texted. Called. Diana picked up on the second ring, and Kelsey said, loudly and clearly, "Hey, can you come down to the laundry room right now? I'm about to head up." She kept eye contact with the man while she said it. He set the shirt down on the bench. He picked up his duffel bag. He said to have a good night, and he walked out. She followed 30 seconds later, took the stairs 2 at a time, and met Diana on the second-floor landing. She was shaking a little by then. They went to the RA's room together and knocked. Campus security came down within the hour. They found the shirt on the bench. They found a folded piece of notebook paper in the alcove behind the last dryer. It must have fallen or been left there during his retreat, and an officer recovered it from the floor between the machine and the wall. It was a handwritten list. Names in one column, student names, based on the 2 she recognized, including her own. Room numbers next to each one. Brief notations beside those. Early riser, works evenings, double room left bed, study break, 10 p.m. 14 names, some with check marks, some with question marks. Security photographed it and collected it as evidence. The building had no formal sign-in requirement for laundry access. The basement door used a keycard reader, but residents held it for people behind them constantly. It was reflexive, courteous. He had entered that way, probably multiple times. The named items made sense now. He'd been reading labels on clothing left in machines or on the folding table, matching names to faces he'd watched coming and going, following residents up from the basement to see which rooms they went into. The granola bars from the communal kitchen, the replaced sock he'd moved freely through the shared areas of the building, learning people. Identifying him took longer than it might seem. The exterior camera footage showed a man matching the description, but the quality wasn't sufficient for immediate identification. It was a combination of footage from a nearby parking structure camera, a license plate captured by a resident's dash cam in the lot, and a prior trespass notice filed at another campus housing complex that ultimately connected the pieces. He had been asked to leave a different residence hall 2 years prior after being reported as a suspicious non-resident. 3 students on the list requested room reassignments. Kelsey didn't. She changed her laundry schedule, always going with Diana from then on, and she bought a small combination lock for her laundry bag. The replacement sock stayed in her drawer for months. She kept moving it from one drawer to another instead of throwing it away, and she didn't examine why for a long time. Eventually, she decided it was because the sock represented something she needed to keep believing was finite and contained. The moment she threw it away, she'd have to sit with the fact that for weeks, someone had been close enough to her clothes, her habits, and her schedule to leave something of himself behind without her ever once knowing he was there. She held on to it a little longer. Most people don't question someone who looks like they belong, someone carrying a clipboard, wearing the right shirt, using the right vocabulary. That appearance of legitimacy is its own kind of access. You don't force a door. You just look like you're supposed to be there and someone holds it open for you. The next story is about what happens when someone walks through a building's front door wearing exactly the right costume. Story 3. Maintenance never sent anyone. The knock came on a Wednesday morning in February, just after 9, while most of Beaumont Hall was either in class or still asleep. Cassandra Liu was one of the ones still there. She'd had a class canceled and was lying on her bed finishing a podcast when she heard a knock on her neighbor's door through the wall, and then one on her own a minute later. She opened it to find a man in dark work pants and a gray collared shirt with an embroidered patch on the chest, the university's building operations logo, or something close enough to it that she didn't look twice. He carried a clipboard and a soft-sided tool bag. He told her a water leak had been reported somewhere on the floor, and he needed to check the connections in the bathrooms. She let him in. He went into the bathroom, removed the access panel behind the sink, looked at the pipes for a minute. He asked how long she'd lived on the floor. She said since August. He wrote something on his clipboard. He asked if the water pressure seemed normal. She said she thought so. He made another note. Then he asked if he could check the bedroom closet. She said that was a strange place to check for a water leak. He said the pipes ran through a shared wall between the bathroom and the closet, and that he needed to look for moisture on the interior panel. Just a minute, he said. She was about to say yes, then her phone buzzed on the desk. A text from her roommate, Becca. "Hey, do you want coffee from the union later?" It had nothing to do with anything, but it made her stop, look up, and actually look at the man rather than just processing him as background. He was very still. That was what she noticed. Most people, when they're waiting for an answer they expect to get, fill the silence a little, they gesture, they add a detail, they shift their weight. He just stood in the middle of her room with his clipboard and waited. Like patience was a method. She said she'd feel better if he checked with the RA first, that it was her roommate's closet too, and she didn't want someone in there when Becca wasn't home. She kept her voice pleasant. He said that was fine, made a final note on his clipboard, told her he'd follow up, and left. She stood in the middle of her room for about 3 minutes. Then she went to the RA's door and knocked. The RA on Cassandra's floor was a senior named Patricia, and she was in her room. Cassandra described the man and the visit. Patricia checked her email for any facilities notice. Nothing. She called the front desk, who called housing, who confirmed. No work order existed for Beaumont Hall that morning. No leak had been reported. Nobody had been dispatched. Patricia called campus security. 2 officers arrived quickly. They reviewed the keycard log for the building's front entrance. The man's entry wasn't there. The door had been opened at 8:47 a.m. by a resident named Carter, who lived on the 3rd floor. And exterior camera footage showed the man following Carter through the door in the same motion. Carter not looking back. The man was gone by the time security arrived. He had knocked on 4 doors that morning. 2 students hadn't answered. Cassandra had let him in. A student on the floor below, named Hannah, had also let him in, and his visit to her room was longer. He'd asked to use the bathroom while there. He'd spent a few minutes inside alone. When he came out, he said the problem wasn't on this floor, and left. The interaction had bothered Hannah enough to mention to her boyfriend the same day, but not enough, she thought then, to report. When investigators searched Hannah's bathroom, they found a small recording device, voice-activated, attached with adhesive to the underside of the drain pipe beneath the sink. It was not freshly installed. The adhesive had been there long enough to collect dust at its edges, and the data stored on the device contained audio from multiple days. This was not the first time someone had been inside Hannah's room. When investigators pulled the building's camera footage going back further, they found what they were looking for, an entry approximately 2 weeks before the February visit. The same man, the same gray collared shirt, walking through the front entrance of Beaumont Hall. This time, Carter was beside him, not a few steps ahead, not a coincidence of timing, but walking next to him through the door. Carter had used his keycard and held the door open. On the footage, the two of them could be seen standing briefly in the lobby, Carter pointing toward the stairwell before heading back toward the elevator. The man had gone up to Hannah's floor alone. Investigators confronted Carter with the footage from both dates. The February visit had looked like a coincidence, Carter entering just before the man, not looking back. The earlier visit made the pattern undeniable. Carter had known him both times. He had let him in on both occasions, and on the first visit had directed him toward Hannah's floor. Carter, who had dated Hannah briefly the previous spring and ended things badly, had told the man which room was hers and when she was typically there. The man had used the same water leak cover story on the first visit to gain entry to her room and plant the device. The February return was to retrieve or replace it. The closet request at Cassandra's room, directly above Hannah's floor, may have been a navigational probe checking whether he could access the same plumbing wall from above or simply the same script applied to the wrong target. Either way, Cassandra's hesitation had stopped him from finding out. The man was charged under the state's electronic surveillance statute. Carter went through the university conduct process and was removed from housing. Hannah moved rooms not because she felt she had to, she said, but because she couldn't stop thinking about what had been captured and when. Cassandra stayed. She thought about the closet for a long time afterward, what he would have looked for in there, whether she was a target or just an adjacent door, and how close she'd come to stepping back and letting him walk through her room while she stood in the doorway being cooperative. It was the text. The 2-second distraction that gave her time to look at him, instead of just nodding and moving aside. "Coffee from the Union, do you want some?" That was the entire distance between ordinary and something she doesn't like to think about. Entry is the most obvious vulnerability in a shared housing system, but some situations don't require forcing a door, tailgating through a lobby, or wearing a convincing uniform. Sometimes the access is already there, sitting in a drawer hanging on a hook, left behind by someone who was supposed to give it back. Story 4. Someone used her key while she slept. Jordan Ellis found the discrepancy by accident. She'd been half asleep 2 Tuesdays earlier when something pulled her out of it. The small electric click her door made when a valid credential was presented to the lock. She'd told herself she was dreaming, rolled over, fallen back asleep. But it stayed with her, and a few days later, she went to the housing app on her phone, the one that lets students view a basic unlock history for their room and looked at the entries from that night. The app showed 2 successful unlocks. The first was at 11:38 p.m. That was her, returning from a late study session in the library. She remembered coming in, setting her bag down, going straight to bed. The second entry was at 4:12 a.m. It was flagged differently from her own, marked as an authorized staff or secondary credential rather than her student card. She had been asleep at 4:12 a.m. She had not let anyone in. She had not heard anything. She went to the housing office the next day and asked for a full audit of her room's lock history, the technical version, with credential identifiers, not just the basic app view. The administrator she spoke with pulled the records while Jordan waited. There were 2 distinct credential IDs in the history. One was Jordan's. The other appeared 9 times over the course of the semester, all between 1 and 5 a.m. All on nights Jordan had gone to bed early. The administrator cross-referenced the second credential number and went quiet for a moment. She said it was associated with a staff-level access card, an RAA passkey that had been assigned to the previous resident of Jordan's room, a student named Tom Warwick, who had served as a resident assistant on the floor the previous academic year. Tom had requested a transfer to another university partway through the spring semester and had signed a form acknowledging he understood he needed to return his credential before leaving. The signature was on file. The physical card was not. When Tom left, whoever closed out his housing role hadn't removed his card from the digital access group for Jordan's room. It should have been scrubbed from the system at departure. It wasn't. The credential had been sitting live in the system for 8 months, attached to a room where someone else now slept. The administrator deactivated it while Jordan stood at the counter. She filed an incident report. She was apologetic in the careful way people are when they know the apology doesn't cover what happened. Jordan walked back to her room slowly. She tried to think clearly about what she knew. Someone had a card that should have been deactivated 8 months ago. It had worked 9 times. She'd been asleep for every one of those entries. She didn't know what had been done inside her room while she was in it. She started looking at things differently. The journal she kept on her desk had appeared in a slightly different position one morning. She'd assumed she'd moved it. A lip balm that lived on the left side of her dresser had turned up on the right. Her power strip had been rearranged. Small things. The kind of things you notice and immediately explain away. She thought about a conversation she'd had with Marcus 3 weeks earlier. Marcus was her closest friend at Greystone Hall, and they spent a lot of time in her room studying. During a conversation about her family, Marcus had mentioned a specific detail about a dinner with her dad's girlfriend, not just that it existed, which he knew, but a particular detail about the evening going badly. She'd written about it in the back pages of her journal. She was almost certain she'd never said it out loud. When she'd asked Marcus how he knew, he'd looked uncertain and said she must have told him. She'd let it drop. He was her closest friend. She thought about it differently now. She thought about how she'd mentioned Tom Warwick once, months ago, as an offhand observation that her room had clearly belonged to an RA, based on the hook placements and an old emergency contact sheet with a name crossed out behind the door. Marcus had recognized the name immediately. He'd lived on the floor the previous year, he said. He and Tom had overlapped. He knew Tom. He knew the room. He'd been in and out of the room all semester. Jordan spent a full day with those thoughts before she went to the campus conduct office. She brought the printed audit. She told them about the journal detail and Marcus. She said she wasn't completely certain of anything, but that she needed someone to look at the timeline. What the conduct investigation uncovered over the following weeks was this. Tom and Marcus had stayed in contact after Tom transferred. At some point before he left, Tom had passed his RA card to Marcus in a casual, almost thoughtless way. Marcus had joked that it would be useful if he ever got locked out, and Tom had handed it over without thinking about it seriously. Marcus had kept the card. When he discovered it still opened Jordan's room, he had used it. Marcus, when confronted with the access logs and presented with the timeline of entries alongside his own sign-in history in the building, did not immediately admit it. But when the conduct officer pointed out that the secondary credential had been used 9 times, all on nights Marcus had been in Jordan's room studying within the previous few hours, he stopped denying it. He asked to speak without his conduct file open, and he told them about the card. Photographs of her journal pages were found in a deleted photos album on his phone during a voluntary device review Marcus agreed to once he'd acknowledged the access. He'd photographed specific entries, personal things. He told them he'd never intended to frighten her, that he cared about her and felt like she never let him fully in, that he just wanted to understand her better. He was removed from residence halls under the conduct process. Jordan was offered a room change, declined, and requested instead that a full hardware-level audit of all active credentials linked to her room be completed before the end of the week, housing obliged. A physical collection policy for RA credentials requiring the card to be surrendered in person, in exchange for a signed receipt, with same-day system deactivation was implemented across all residence halls. She still keeps a journal. She said she never stopped, even through the worst of it. But the first few pages of every new volume she leaves completely blank. She doesn't write an explanation for it. She just starts a few pages in, where the paper is still clean and unread and entirely her own. There are rooms in every residence hall that nobody talks about, rooms that stand empty between one occupant and the next, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. Officially, those rooms are locked and logged. Officially, nobody is in them. The last story is about what happens when officially and actually stop meaning the same thing. Story 5. The empty room across the hall. Nadia Osei arrived at Vanthorpe University's Irwin Hall in late August, at the start of her junior year. She'd lived on campus her first year, off campus her second, and had come back to campus housing for practical reasons. A single room had opened up in Irwin at a lower cost than her apartment, and the commute had been wearing her down. She wanted to be closer to the architecture library. She wanted to be able to walk home at 2 a.m. without worrying about it. Her room was 308, on the 3rd floor in the east wing. The building sat on a slope, so the windows on one side faced a retaining wall, while the opposite side looked over the courtyard. The building was the oldest on Vanthorpe's residential campus, built in the early 60s and renovated in successive layers. The ceilings were high. The plumbing announced itself. The hallways carried sound strangely, so that the floor above was sometimes more audible than the room beside you. The building had another feature that became relevant later, a narrow maintenance corridor running along the building's north face behind the east wing rooms, accessed through locked utility doors at either end of each floor. The corridor was part of the original construction built for pipe access and electrical work, and it ran between the exterior wall and the backs of the east wing closets. At its widest, it was about 4 feet across, with a poured concrete floor and a steel maintenance catwalk through the tighter sections, where conduit and pipe runs reduced the clearance further. It was not comfortable, but it was solid and navigable. Irwin Hall's facilities staff used it a few times a year when they needed access to the old plumbing stack without disturbing residents. Most residents had no idea it was there. Across the hall from 308 was room 307. Room 307 was empty when Nadia arrived. She'd looked in during move-in weekend when it was propped open, bare mattress, no curtains, closet gaping. She assumed someone would take it soon. By the end of the second week of classes, nobody had. She asked her neighbor Rosa, a fourth year in 309, who said the room had been occupied during the summer session by a student named Derek, who'd taken a medical withdrawal. Rosa thought housing might place someone there in October. She hadn't thought about it since August. Nadia stopped thinking about it too. The first thing she heard was footsteps. A Tuesday night in late September, just before midnight, while she was at her desk. Ordinary movement, a few steps, a pause, a few more steps. She assumed it was the room above, which was occupied. She went to bed. A week later, same time. She paid closer attention and tracked the sound as coming from across the hall rather than above. She stood in the middle of her room and turned slowly. Across, not up. She stood there for 2 full minutes. The sound stopped. She went back to her desk and told herself that a 60-year-old building was allowed to be strange. She mentioned it to Rosa in the dining hall. Rosa said she'd heard it once too, thought it was the building settling. They agreed that Irwin was old and weird. In the first week of October, a bag of Nadia's groceries went missing from the communal refrigerator on their floor. Her name was on the bag in black marker. When she went back for it, the bag was gone. 2 pieces of fruit and a yogurt were on the shelf without the bag. She posted a note on the fridge asking if anyone had taken it by mistake. Nobody responded. She bought more groceries and labeled them clearly. 2 weeks after that, Rosa knocked on Nadia's door and asked about her granola bars. A full box in the communal kitchen cabinet down to 2, and she'd found a half-eaten sleeve of crackers behind the cabinet's back row, tucked against the wall that she was certain wasn't hers. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Rosa said she'd heard the footsteps from across the hall again, at 3 in the morning, 4 days ago. She'd stood at her door and listened, then been too tired to do anything. She'd almost knocked on Brian's door and hadn't. They went to Brian together. Brian, their RA, was a junior who took things seriously without being excitable. He listened, then took his passkey to room 307 and let himself in. Nadia and Rosa waited in the hall. He walked through the room, bare mattress, bare walls, bathroom clear, closet empty. He came back out and said he hadn't found anything, but that he'd walk the floor more often at night and to let him know if it happened again. Nadia heard the footsteps 4 nights later. She was in bed, wide awake. She'd been waiting for them. 1:30 in the morning. Slow, unhurried movement. A pause. Then a sound like someone settling their weight carefully onto something solid. She got up and stood at her door without opening it for 5 minutes. Heard nothing more. Then she opened it. The hallway was empty. The door to 307 closed. She went back to bed and didn't sleep again until almost 4. In the morning, walking to the communal bathroom, she paused at room 307 and crouched down to look at the base of the door. There was a scuff mark along the bottom of the door frame. Not a single impact, but the kind of layered wear made by a door, opened and closed repeatedly over time. She took a photograph. She also looked at the door latch more carefully. The strike plate was scratched in a pattern that didn't match the usual wear from keycard access. The marks were on the interior edge of the frame. Something had been worked against the latch from the inside. She couldn't say what. She photographed that too and went to find Brian. He came back down with her, looking at the photographs, and said he was going to request a facilities inspection and report it to housing. He made the call while she stood in the hallway. A facilities staff member came that afternoon and opened room 307 with a building master key. He did a full walkthrough with Brian present. He checked the bathroom, the closet, the window. Then he went to the back of the closet and pushed against the rear panel. It shifted. The back wall of the closet in room 307 was not a fixed surface. It was a removable access panel, original to the building's design, that connected directly to the maintenance corridor running along the building's north face. It was supposed to be fastened with 2 hex bolts from the corridor side and painted over during the last renovation. The bolts were missing. The panel swung inward into the corridor with a steady push. The facilities worker stepped through into the corridor and turned on his flashlight. Brian followed and stopped in the opening. Roughly 10 feet in from the panel, sitting against the exterior wall on the concrete floor of the catwalk, was a compression sleeping bag rolled thin, a small backpack, and an empty water bottle on its side. The backpack held a change of clothes, a phone charging cable, a pen light, and about a day's worth of packaged food. 3 granola bar wrappers were in the front pocket, the same brand Rosa had been missing from the communal kitchen cabinet. Brian stepped back into the closet. He told Nadia and Rosa to go to Rosa's room and lock the door. His voice was steady, but he said it quickly. They went. Rosa's room was directly next door to 308, and Nadia sat on Rosa's bed and listened. She heard Brian on his phone in the hallway, heard the facilities worker moving back through the corridor. And then she heard something else. Movement inside the wall. Not the slow, careful sounds she'd been tracking for weeks. This was faster. A scrape of something against concrete, a thud that traveled through the shared structure of the building. And then, from the far end of the hallway, the unmistakable heavy slam of a metal door hitting a frame. The utility door, the one at the north end of the corridor. Rosa grabbed Nadia's arm. They could hear Brian's voice change in the hallway, shorter, louder, and then he was at Rosa's door, knocking and saying they needed to come out now and move toward the stairwell. Not running, he said, just moving. He shepherded them and 2 other residents from nearby rooms, a student named Paulo, who'd opened his door at the noise, and another who'd been on her way to the bathroom down the east wing hallway and into the main stairwell. He held the door and told them to go down to the lobby and stay there. Nadia went. She sat in the lobby on a bench near the front desk, with Rosa beside her while campus security moved through the building above them. She could hear radio traffic at the front desk, clipped and fast. At some point, an officer jogged through the lobby toward the building's north side exit. The lobby doors were propped open, and cold air came through from outside. She sat very still and looked at the floor and waited. The utility door at the north end of the 3rd floor corridor, Irwin's top residential level, opened onto an exterior landing and a service staircase that ran down the building's north face to a ground-level gate. By the time an officer reached the far end of the maintenance corridor from within, and another came up the exterior staircase from below, the gate at the bottom was swinging open. Whoever had been in the corridor was gone. Campus security secured both utility doors and sealed the access panel in room 307's closet, temporarily with a padlock from their kit. They brought Nadia up from the lobby after about 40 minutes to walk through room 308 with an officer and confirm whether anything had been disturbed. Her room looked as she'd left it. Then the officer showed her what the facility's supervisor had found in the corridor earlier, in the section of the catwalk that ran directly behind the north wall of room 308. At that point in the corridor, set into the interior wall at roughly seated height, was an old maintenance opening original to the building's construction, smaller than the closet panel, designed for routing cable through the wall stack. It was covered by a sheet metal plate that was supposed to be bolted from the corridor side. The bolts had been removed. Behind the plate was a channel in the wall that connected, at the room side, to a return air grill mounted above Nadia's desk. The grill on her side of the wall was standard-looking gray, louvered, fixed in its frame. From the corridor side, with the plate removed, the channel provided a direct and unobstructed line of sight into her room. The officer told her this in a level voice and let her ask all the questions she needed to ask. She didn't ask many. She sat in the hallway outside her room with her back against the wall and looked at the floor and stayed like that for a while. He was identified 2 days later. His name was Owen, 22 years old. He was not a Vanthorpe student and had never been. He had attended a community college in another state the previous year, hadn't completed the term, and had come to the Vanthorpe area in August because a friend had offered him a place to stay. The friend changed their mind once he arrived. He had no money for a deposit anywhere and no realistic option, he said, that he'd been able to make himself take. He had come onto campus for food. The dining hall wasn't difficult to enter without credentials if you moved with the flow of students at the right hour. He'd been in the east wing of Irwin Hall one afternoon when the north utility door had been left improperly latched after a maintenance visit. He'd found the corridor, spent time in it, come back. Then he'd found the loose access panel in room 307's closet, which gave him access to a vacant room when he needed to move around or use the bathroom. He'd been living this way for 6 weeks. He walked into the campus security office the morning after he was discovered, backpack on, hands visible, and said he was the person they were looking for. He sat in a chair and answered questions for 2 hours. He said he had not intended to harm anyone. He said he knew how that sounded. He said he'd been trying to figure out how to leave the situation without making it worse and had not found an answer before Nadia found one for him. None of that changed what had been taken from her. The 6 weeks of nights she'd spent in her room, believing the door was the only boundary that mattered, not knowing to wonder about the wall. The grill above her desk she'd sat below every day without looking at twice. The degree to which he had known her movements, her schedule, the interior of her room, not because he'd been inside it, but because he hadn't needed to be. Owen was charged with criminal trespass, unauthorized occupancy, and theft. He was placed in a county shelter program while the legal process ran its course. He did not contest the charges. The university's response addressed both the immediate failure and the structural one. The maintenance corridor was retained. It contained active plumbing and electrical systems that facility staff needed to reach, but every access point was upgraded. Both utility doors on the east wing were replaced with electronically controlled units, each requiring an individually logged facility's credential to open. Door open sensors and tamper alarms were installed on each door and on the interior access panels. The panels themselves were reinforced with steel backing on the room side. A mandatory monthly inspection protocol was put in place, with logged sign-offs from the facility's supervisor. The return air channel adjacent to room 308 was permanently blocked and replastered on both sides. Nadia didn't request a room change. She moved her desk away from the wall where the grill had been. She had the new grill cover, the sealed replacement unit, checked twice by the facilities worker who installed it, and she asked him to show her the interior of the channel before he finished the job. He did. For the rest of that year, every morning when she left room 308, she paused at the utility door at the end of the hallway. The new unit with its electronic latch and its tamper alarm, solid and flush in the frame. She'd look at it for a second, check that the indicator light was green and the seam was tight. It always was. She checked anyway, the same way you check a stove you know you've turned off. Not because you expect to find it wrong, because the act of checking is itself a way of staying present, of deciding every single morning that you are paying attention. She never stopped checking. 5 buildings, 5 situations that began with something small, all a person already in the room. A man on a bench who asked one question too many. A knock at the right hour of morning. A number in a lock log that shouldn't have been there. A sound from across the hall at 1:30 a.m. What connects them isn't the nature of the threat. Each situation was different. What connects them is the gap, the space between how a system is supposed to work and how it actually works when you factor in the ordinary unpredictability of people. Forms don't get completed, cards don't get returned, doors get held open out of habit. Rooms that are supposed to be checked don't get checked. None of the students here were careless. They noticed something. Each of them had a moment where a detail was slightly off, and each of them made a choice about whether to act on it. A scuff mark on a door frame, a worker who stood too still, a log entry at an hour when they were asleep, a man on a bench with no laundry running. Those moments were small enough to dismiss. They chose not to dismiss them. If one of these stayed with you, I'd like to know which one. Leave it in the comments. If you're new to Mind After Dark, subscribe before you go. There's more where this came from. Stay aware. Good night.